Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Genesis 39, 1-2. The account of Joseph entering Egypt initiates a major sequence of events that would one day fulfill a promise, a covenant that God the Almighty established with Abraham in Genesis 15 to deliver his people to the promised land. However, it would only be fulfilled after a 400-year sojourn in a foreign land. Beginning in Genesis 37:28, we see how Joseph, the youngest of Jacob's sons, being sold to some Midianite merchants by his brothers, who are en route to Egypt. This single act of selling their brother would set off this chain of events that we will divide into 4 parts in this epoch: the arrival, multiplication, slavery, and judgment, all of which leads to our next epoch, the Exodus, being perhaps the most significant in the entire Old Testament. It all begins in verse 36, where the Midianites reach Egypt and sell Joseph to Potiphar, captain of the Pharaoh's palace guard. But we need to jump forward to the time of Joseph's accession to the power he would eventually yield in Egypt. Upon arrival, we come to a couple of very important questions. First, we need to establish which administrative position Joseph was given by Pharaoh. The answer is given to us by cross-referencing the text from ancient Hebrew and the position of second in command as recorded in the installation of the vizier document. So we can deduce that the position was vizier. The second question is, which dynastic period does this occur? To determine this, we need to do a bit of an analysis. When Jean-François Champollion announced the transliteration of the Egyptian hieroglyphs from the Rosetta Stone in 1822, he virtually unlocked our ability to read and understand Egypt's ancient writing system for the first time in history. It allows Egyptologists to now forge ahead to read hieroglyphic text inside ancient tombs and temple walls. This text tells the stories, the names of pharaohs and rulers, and their achievements throughout their history. This information can then be compared to the biblical text to determine not only our precise period of Joseph's authority in the land, but also to confirm the rest of the biblical narrative of the Israelites' time spent in the kingdom for their remainder of the time in the land. Scholars have mistakenly been attributing Ramesses as the pharaoh at the time of Moses and the Exodus, drawing upon the scripture verses of Genesis 47:11, Exodus 1:11, and Exodus 12:37. However, a closer look at them don't actually refer to Pharaoh himself as being Ramesses, but to the land of Ramesses and the treasure city of Ramesses. It is this very detail that has always had skeptics of the Bible determine that the Israelites were never in Egypt, as it was recorded in Genesis. They can clearly see that there is no archaeological evidence for Israelites being in Egypt during that period. Not only was this a poor interpretation, but we have now confirmed that Moses could have never been a contemporary of Ramesses, thanks to the discovery and translation of the Merneptah stele found at Thebes in 1896. It reads that Ramesses campaigned in Canaan, even detailing the names of cities in the kingdom of Israel. Therefore, if Ramesses was pharaoh at the time of Moses, according to the Exodus account, there would have been no cities in Canaan with those names in existence yet. So we can confidently push back the time of the Israelites much earlier than the time of Ramesses. No credible historian gave the story of the Exodus a second glance because there was no evidence to be found in Egypt for the Israelites at that time. But now we see that archaeologists have been looking at the wrong time frame. Indeed, we will discover that this has been the problem all along, because now we can take all what we've learned and see a great deal of evidence, beginning with Joseph's rise to power in Egypt. The story says that he started his sojourn in Egypt as a slave, briefly won favor with the royal family, then imprisoned for a period of time. Then, by interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, he soon finds himself given the rank of the highest official in the land. Now, keeping in mind, there is a high likelihood that much of his traces were destroyed or removed from temple walls for the very reason that the time of the future Pharaoh was killed by God in the Red Sea, all mention of Joseph would have been a stain to them. The event would have been humiliating beyond measure. Nevertheless, what we have is a very convincing collection of evidence to present. In Genesis 41 through 42, it states, "Then Pharaoh formally declared to Joseph, 'I am placing you in charge of the entire land in Egypt.' Pharaoh took his ring off his own hand and placed it on the hand of Joseph. This would have been a temporary arrangement by the time Pharaoh could have a signet ring made for Joseph. According to archaeological records, these rings were a seal of royal authority and would include the wordings like Son of Ra, establishing a claim to true power by the gods or God to whom they identify with. However, if Joseph were to have his own ring, it would be forbidden to use the name of an outside god. In Psalms 135, the repeated Jewish prayer service states, "God selected Jacob as his own, and Israel as his treasure." In Hebrew, the first part of this formula is stated this way: Jacob, or Jacob, Bahar, he chose. In other words, if you were Joseph, you would not declare yourself to be a son of God, but instead a son of Jacob, who is chosen by God. This, as experts reveal, leads to us the only formula available: Jacob Bahar. Now, in Egyptian inscription practices, the final letter of one word was used to begin another to save space if they matched, which was common practice in these signet rings, given the minimal space available. Another important factor was that Hebrew did not have vowels, only consonants. So to sum it up, the biblical and rabbinic texts provide the formula that would state YKBHR. Since the 1960s, the Austrian Archaeological Institute has been excavating in the eastern Nile Delta in the region that the Bible calls Goshen, where the Israelites were said to have settled. Director of excavations with the institute is Professor Emeritus of Egyptology Manfred Biatek. At the site of Tel El Daba, Biatek uncovered 9 royal seals with the letters YKBHR, likely worn by Joseph and his court officials. Now we have perfect synchronicity between the Genesis accounts and Egyptian archaeology dating to the Middle Kingdom period. Next up, the Genesis accounts tells us that during this time, Joseph goes to work to store up harvests for the next 7 years, drastically adjusting for massive crop growth. This is the period where we expect to find a number of areas to find this evidence, and that brings us to the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. To bring into context this item of evidence, we need to understand the nature and cause for the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, and it all has to do with the Nile River. The first clue is in text about the dream. Genesis 47, 17 through 18. So Pharaoh told Joseph, "In my dream, there I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came out of the Nile and began to feed amongst the brushes." Every year in the spring, the Nile inundates the lowlands of the plains and floods the land where the farmland sits upon. The water level to which it reaches determines whether it brings nourishing soil for the coming season or destroys any chance to produce anything for years if water levels get too high. Ancient Egyptian records reveal that in the 3rd year of the reign of Amenhotep III, levels reached a height of 18 meters, creating optimal conditions of fertile silt for the following years. Then, By the 10th year of his reign, flood levels soared to new heights never recorded before, reaching a staggering 21 meters high, 4 times the average height we've seen in the last 2,000 years alone. This would have been complete and utter destruction for all of the farmland. Even much of the livestock was killed by drowning. This would have caused years of famine in the area, as planting crops would have been impossible in this waterlogged ground. Now, it makes clear a picture as to why Pharaoh's dream conveyed a cow coming out of the Nile. And when we read Genesis 45 verse 6, the verse also makes a great deal of sense. For this is the 2nd year there has been famine in the country, and there are still 5 years to come without plowing or harvest. We need to note here that if the 7 years of famine was due to a drought, as most scholars suggest, then that would not explain this verse, since farmers would not stop plowing in such a case. However, they would not attempt to plow if the farmland was logged with water. Joseph knew precisely what was to come once the dream was interpreted, and it was pure genius on his part for what he embarked on to prepare for this coming inundation. Southwest of Cairo today lies Fayum Lake. It has been here throughout Egyptian history. During the reign of Amenhotep III, a canal was built stretching due south from the lake, running parallel with the Nile to finally reach the mighty river 100 kilometers down. It would have had the capacity to siphon off as much as 50% of the floodwater and redirect it off course and drain into this massive Fayum depression, filling it several times the size it was. This would have been the greatest feat Egypt had ever accomplished to save itself. And the biggest piece of evidence that we can attribute this triumph to Joseph is the fact that this canal, still present today, which dates back to the similar period, and its name has survived until now, Bar Yusuf, or the waterway of Joseph. On an island near the first cataract of the Nile near Aswan stands an ancient inscription written in the 4th century BC, which appears to be a copy of an earlier document. It is an account of a land grant by Pharaoh to the priests. It tells of 7 years of prosperity, followed by 7 years of famine. It goes on to say that Pharaoh consulted his chancellor or vizier for help. It contains most of the elements we read in Genesis. Next, we would expect that, as vizier, Joseph would begin a major initiative to store up grains and other crops in preparation for a coming famine. Near the ancient burial ground of Saqqara, just south of the step pyramid of Djoser, is found 11 massive pits deep underground. These are clearly not tombs, but unsealed pits that are all connected by ducts leading to one main pit, making it accessible at one location. At one end of the compound is an entrance with a long passageway leading directly to this location. Many archaeologists believe this to be granaries, which would make perfect storehouses for grain, and the single passage allows for secure storage and center of distribution. Genesis 41 verse 49. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Over a century ago, samples were taken from the bottom of these pits, and upon closer examination were found remaining impressions of grain. Join me next time in part 2 of the settlement in Egypt, where we explore the evidence for a great multiplication of a Hebrew population in the Nile Delta. Here on Evidence Uncovered.